1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, known around the world as the Soviet Union, basically signs away its own existence. By allowing the numerous republics that made up the Soviet Union to declare independence, President Mikhail Gorbachev became the last uncontested leader of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union also indicated the end of the Cold War, a conflict that had been prevalent since World War II. The world would become a very different place in the 1990s, but was the Soviet Union, bound together through the Warsaw Pact, and Western nations like Britain, France, and the United States, bound together through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, always destined to be rivals or enemies? The end of the Cold War may stand, in some circles, as a testament to capitalism defeating communism once and for all. But is that all there is to the story? In order to understand the complex relationship between the major Eastern and Western powers of the 20th century, pivotal moments in history must be examined. One of these moments is a consideration of the infamous Moscow trials of the 1930s and how they affected the relationship between the Soviet Union and another world power, Britain.
The Soviet Union has a long and complicated history, one that deserves and has received its own close inspection. But in order to describe what happens later, a brief overview of the origins of the USSR is necessary. For many years, Russia had been run by a monarchy. However, by the beginning of the 20th century, the people of the country were not fully satisfied with the poverty that had been forced upon them, especially while Tsar Nicholas II lived in luxury. But after a near coup in 1905, he was forced to give some concessions, which allowed the Russian Empire to continue limping forward. But by World War I and its disastrous effects on the Russian people, the seeds of revolution began to grow. In 1917, while Nicholas II was at the front playing soldier, his empire was turned upside down in what is now called the February Revolution. But the provisional government meant to fill the void of leadership was not to last, as the October Revolution of the same year once again brought governmental change. It was during this time that a leader and his political party would rise to prominence: Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. He was not alone, and the men who were major players before the outset of the October Revolution would act as a support base for years to come. They were known as the Old Bolsheviks, and included the likes of Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Joseph Stalin, and Nikolai Bukharin, among others. These names would become very well known in time. The Russian Revolution may have brought the Bolsheviks to power, but it was solidified through the Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1917 until 1922. By 1923, and after many years of intense fighting, the Soviet Union came into being, with the Bolsheviks solely in charge. The one-party system would dominate the political arena, with Lenin as the figurehead. But this would not last, as Lenin's poor health resulted in his death in 1924. As a result, a power struggle ensued within the leadership. Although Trotsky may have been the initial frontrunner, he was marginalized by the other leaders, and eventually Stalin emerged as the head of state, also defeating Zinoviev and Kamenev in the process. At this early point in Soviet history, defeated Bolsheviks, such as Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, were not executed, merely stripped of their party membership and excluded from state affairs. This leniency would not continue through Stalin's reign, and the eventual ends of the Old Bolsheviks would come to act as a major moment in the Soviet Union. As Stalin moved to take complete control of the USSR, he changed the ideology of socialism from a global initiative to socialism in one country. Basically, he began to look inward, and the rest of the world took a back seat. In order to ensure the Soviet economy would survive on its own, massive collectivization and industrialization campaigns were instituted with the first five-year plan in 1928. Although it could be argued that the goals in terms of quotas were met, the costs in human lives from the persecution of the kulaks and widespread famine were devastating. But news of these famines and millions of deaths did not readily reach Western ears and news outlets. While Britain recognized the Soviet Union in 1924, the United States did not even formally recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. What would come next, however, would be seen and heard around the world.
In 1934, Sergei Kirov, the popular leader of the Leningrad Party, was assassinated by Leonid Nikolaev. The aftermath of this assassination, which may or may not have been given under Stalin's orders, led to purges that would see millions more dead in the coming years. They also gave pretext to the Moscow trials, which would introduce the world to the Soviet Union as never before, as many of the old Bolsheviks would be tried, convicted, and executed in a public format. The NKVD, the precursor to the infamous KGB, began to round up and eliminate any perceived threat to the Soviet Union. In the years leading up to World War II, this great terror would envelop the entire nation. In August of 1936, the trial of the 16 would see the conviction and deaths of all the accused, which included former head of the Communist International Grigory Zinoviev, as well as former Soviet Premier Lev Kamenev. Both men had been closely associated with Vladimir Lenin, but had fallen out of favor in the years after his death. Along with 14 other defendants, they were accused of various crimes against the Soviet state, including terrorism in conjunction with Leon Trotsky, the death of Kirov, and the attempted assassinations of other Soviet officials, including Stalin himself. Although not present in court, Trotsky, the former commander of the Red Army, was a constant presence during this and all future trials. Despite the paltry evidence produced, all the defendants confessed to the crimes that they were accused of, and were all subsequently found guilty. Although men like Zinoviev and Kamenev, both career politicians, had allegedly only confessed under the promise of receiving mercy, they were not spared in the end. None of them were. Although it had likely been in the works for years, the entire trial took less than a week. The trial of the anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center soon followed, in January 1937. This time, 17 men were put on trial, including government officials such as Karl Radek. Once again, confessions acted as the primary means of evidence to establish the guilt of the accused, who supposedly worked with Nazi Germany to overthrow Stalin. The trial ended in 13 executions and long prison sentences for the rest. It was Karl Radek's testimony that would lead to the arrest of some of those who would be involved in the third Moscow trial, which was soon to follow. The third and final major trial was called the Trial of the 21, or the Bloc of Rightists and Trotskyites. As the name suggests, in March of 1938, 21 men were put on trial for crimes against the Soviet Union, including attempted assassinations and conspiring to overthrow the government. This trial included the likes of Nikolai Bukharin, the former chairman of the Communist International, former Soviet Premier Alexei Rykov, and former head of the NKVD, Genrikh Yagoda. Yagoda had been a major player in the early stages of the purges, but its usefulness had apparently worn out, being replaced by Nikolai Yezhov in 1936. Yezhov would prove to be instrumental in the planning and execution of the Moscow trials. However, it was Nikolai Bukharin's global fame as a Marxist historian that made this trial particularly intriguing. It was his confession that was the hardest to procure, taking months, but provided the basis for the entire affair. Only 3 defendants got prison sentences, with the rest being executed upon conviction, including Bukharin. In between the second and third of the Moscow trials, a secret trial of the major Red Army generals took place. For rather obvious reasons, the case of the Trotskyist anti-Soviet military organization was far less public than the rest, but the deaths of senior military personnel, including Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, would become a major problem with World War II fast approaching. 3 public trials between 1936 and 1938, all with the same verdict, guilty, and all with the same sentence, death. Another connection between the trials was the overarching figure of Leon Trotsky, whose exile from the Soviet Union in 1929 had allowed him to escape being a defendant at the trials, although his name was never far from the proceedings. Since he was abroad, in whatever country would allow him asylum, his presence would become a major part of the reception of the trials in the West. The Moscow trials are considered to be show trials, meaning that those involved were essentially actors in a production. Through coercion, the men read lines from a script that ensured their conviction and eventual deaths. Britain, in particular, would be very vocal about the validity of the trials, both for and against. It may be difficult to consider, but Western interpretations of the trials were not as clear-cut as may be thought. It is this intense debate that must be considered here, as well as why such stances were maintained throughout the years of the Moscow trials in interwar Britain. Foreigners were actually encouraged to attend the court proceedings, which was practically unheard of in the Soviet Union. In their haste, some even attended without a full comprehension of the Russian language. British reporters and other parties were not exempt from this, and as a result, Britain was incredibly involved in the aftermath of the Moscow trials. The fallout it produced led to a heated debate within Britain, based around political and ideological allegiance, and the trials could then act as a plane on which the opposing sides could do battle. One of London's most famous newspapers, The Times, published updates throughout all the trials. The Times has been in publication since 1785 and continues as of 2015. Each trial was covered by correspondents of the newspaper, oftentimes coming by telegram from Riga, Latvia, to the Home Office in London. Their coverage was largely absent of any sensationalism, the writers showing restraint in that regard. Instead, the facts as they are stated in the trials are offered, such as the prosecutor's speech imploring the deaths of the prisoners in the trial of the 16, or the backgrounds of the defendants at the trial of 21. Although there may not have been significant controversy raised by the correspondents, the paper did publish editorials by some who took a firm stance against the trials. One F.H. Hamilton wrote to the editor, George Jeffrey Dawson at the time, that the charges made against the defendants in the second trial would be deemed fantastic in a lunatic asylum. At the same time, there was a consideration of communism as an infection rather than a creed. Apparently there were those who were at the Times who were adamantly against the trials, which in turn soured them on communism as a whole. This relatively straightforward approach was countered by the Daily Worker, a newspaper which consistently indicated its support for the trials. Known as the Morning Star after 1966, the Daily Worker was originally founded by the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1930. From the beginning of the trials, its publications expressed consistent approval. The trials were covered with a grandeur of sorts, as the writers, which included the likes of Dennis Noel Pritt, J.R. Campbell, and Robert Page Arnott, among many others, showed their continued support throughout all three major trials. General Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Henry Pollitt, said that the trials in Moscow represent a new triumph in the history of progress. High praise for the trials was a common feature of the paper throughout the 1930s. There were some who realized the limitations of the prosecution. William Rust, the Daily Worker's first editor, was one of the few who freely admitted the confession stood as the only tangible evidence against the defendants. On the other hand, another editor of the paper, John Ross Campbell, was rather more forward when he stated that it was the enemies of socialism and peace who have perished. We should not mourn. After the verdict of the trial of the 21, the Independent Labour Party of Britain sent an appeal to the Soviet Union, asking for mercy for the convicted. The response of the Daily Worker was to run the headline, "Degenerates Appeal for Degenerates." Clearly, no love was lost between the paper and those it considered as enemies. There were also open attacks on other newspapers, such as the Daily Herald, in which it undermined the credibility of its competitors and attempted to push forward the Daily Worker's own agenda. There were even demands made to its readers, such as sending letters of protest to competing papers. There was particular emphasis, as the 1930s wore on, to move against Trotskyism. Since Leon Trotsky's exile began, he had been a lingering thorn in the side of the Soviet Union, refusing to settle down. He continued publishing materials and spoke against the trials on numerous occasions. This would fuel the Daily Worker's crusade against him. As fascist leaders such as Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco came to power in Europe, the battle against fascism heightened. Trotsky was then grouped in with these enemies, being called a political degenerate, an ally of fascism, a vile maniacal enemy of socialism and peace. It was even printed that wherever there was a screw loose in Russia, it was Trotsky who loosened it. A single man became a rallying cry behind which all those who supported Stalin could cluster. British supporters of the Moscow trials often used arguments detailing the defendants' alleged affiliations with Trotsky, and the Daily Worker was no exception. Aside from newspapers, there were many individuals who spoke in defense of the practices of the Soviet Union during the Moscow trials. One of these was prominent member of parliament, lawyer, and noted Soviet supporter Dennis Noel Pritt, who was in the foreign press box during the first Moscow trial. Although he was never a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, he wrote in several pamphlets defending the verdict. In both the Zinoviev trial and at the Moscow trial, Pritt noted specifics about the court proceedings and was particularly adamant about the guilt of the defendants. The confessions of Zinoviev, Kamenev, and the rest were apparently the primary means behind this mindset. Indeed, if they confessed to the crimes, then what other evidence was needed? The question of the validity behind the defendants' confessions would become a mainstay in the trials to come. In the pamphlet The Zinoviev Trial, Pritt stated,
"The most important part of the study of the criticisms, in respect of which I do not think I need apologizing for writing at some length, has now been carried to this point, that the evidence was pretty strong, that the accused, when confronted it, having the opportunity to consider it and to make up their minds, elected to plead guilty. They were experienced, intelligent, and educated men, and they said that they were guilty. That might well be the end of the matter.
Pritt judged the defendants, some with long histories within the Soviet system, by the weight of their words, and would hear little argument otherwise. He made another bold statement in the preface to a pro-Soviet pamphlet called The Moscow Trial Was Fair, co-written by Pat Sloan.
The executive authorities of the USSR may have taken, by the successful prosecution of the case, a very big step in eradicating counter-revolutionary activities. But it is equally clear that the judicature and the prosecuting attorney of the USSR have taken at least as great a step towards establishing their reputation among the legal systems of the modern world.
The prosecuting attorney mentioned was Andrei Vyshinsky, who presided over all three trials and argued for the deaths of all the defendants. He survived the purges and continued his career in Soviet politics, eventually taking the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs. Pritt was also critical of the attempts of others in impeding the trials in any way. Before the first trial began, a now infamous telegram was sent by both the Labor and Socialist International, as well as the International Federation of Trade Unions, to the USSR. The goal of the telegram was, among other things, to ensure judicial guarantees to the defendants, as well as given counsel who shall be independent of the government. Through his writing, it seems as though Pritt took great offense to these demands and made significant arguments against them. By Pritt's standards, the Soviet Union was a civilized country and should be left to make their own judgments, which made him criticize the actions of these international organizations' attempts to interfere with the process. Altogether, D.N. Pritt wholeheartedly supported the trial of the 16, including the outcome, which saw all the defendants put to death. He continued to be unimpressed with theories of coerced confessions, effectively turning the argument on its head by asking detractors if the allegations against the trials were made in order to discredit a Soviet country in the eyes of the world. Thus, the Moscow trials, although at this point there had been only one, may perhaps be seen as a microcosm of the entire idea of the Soviet Union. To its supporters, the nation could not be allowed to falter, even for a moment. W.G. Shepard also voiced his approval for the first Moscow trial in a pamphlet titled The Moscow Trial, August 1936. An interesting point is raised within concerning the British reaction to the trial, indicating how the show of support for the now deceased defendants was far from the norm. Men such as Zinoviev and Kamenev had rarely received any positive press before their executions. The pamphlet included statements such as,
"It was because of their lack of faith in the masses that Trotsky and his supporters could not believe that the working class of Russia would go through all the privations and suffering which were necessary in order to bring the Soviet Union into the front rank of industrial countries and thus make the victory of socialism possible."
The lack of faith that is mentioned could have acted as an excuse for condemning former Bolshevik leaders, but evidently Shepard considered them guilty of their crimes. Leon Trotsky's inclusion in the pamphlet cannot be understated either, since his presence loomed over the trials and was one of its major targets. This differed from D.N. Pritt's pamphlet, which barely considered Trotsky at all. Shepard also noted the inclusion of Pritt in the foreign press box at the trial itself, stating that since the man himself was above reproach, then his support for the proceedings could not be undermined. The esteem that he held for Pritt was seemingly another motivation for supporting the trial and its verdict. In a similar fashion to Pritt and Shepard, British politician and co-founder of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Robert Page Arnott, was present at the third Moscow trial, the trial of the 21. Although he often wrote for the Daily Worker, he was joined this time by Canadian politician Tim Buck, who was a leader in the Communist International at the time. Together, the two expressed their support for the trial in a pamphlet called Fascist Agents Exposed in the Moscow Trials. Again, there is mention of the importance of the trials, especially in relation to the fight against fascism. In their words, the trial demonstrated the unshakable strength of the Soviet Union and the enthusiastic unity of the people in defense of their socialist achievements. In order to defend socialism, the defendants needed to be executed. The authors even went so far to say that the trial itself was an important factor in the struggle to maintain peace. By putting so much weight behind the outcome, the Moscow trials could be seen to take a higher purpose, that of protecting the world against fascism and moving it towards lasting peace. Whether this would truly have the desired effect is up to history to decide. These witnesses were not alone either, as other prominent Brits expressed approval for the trials. This included the likes of socialist and economist Martha Beatrice Webb, who stated that she was happy that Stalin cut out the dead wood in his government. The Communist Party of Great Britain's lawyer, the barrister Dudley Collard, published Soviet Justice and the Trial of Radek and Others, an entire book which acted as a defense of the first two Moscow trials. D.N. Pritt collaborated with him by writing the introduction. Pat Sloan, in collaboration with D.N. Pritt, also voiced an opinion on the outcome of the trial. A member of the Friends of the Soviet Union, he insinuated that the disapproval of British papers such as the Daily Mail and the Daily Herald was unfounded, since the defendants had no choice but to plead guilty, since they knew what they had done was worthy of guilt. He also stated that he did not see what was unconvincing in the Moscow trial. The importance of the confessions was once again reintroduced and hailed as proof of wrongdoing. Leon Trotsky met his end by an assassin's hands in 1940 under Stalin's orders. The depth of his alleged involvement was once again shown through W. Wainwright's volatile work, Clear Out Hitler's Agents. In 1942, 2 years after Trotsky's assassination, Wainwright produced a pamphlet in which Trotskyists, the supporters of Trotsky, are blatantly called enemies of the people. It also acted as a defense of Britain and British ideals, since Trotskyists supposedly oppose and hate the leaders of Russia. They want to see Russia defeated and Hitler victorious. They want to weaken Britain, Russia's ally. Although the man himself was already dead, his legacy continued on, acting as an ongoing source of controversy. The author even equated Trotskyists to Nazis, showing to what extent Trotsky had fallen in the eyes of Stalinists. The former Bolshevik leader was branded as an enemy, along with any who gave support to him or his ideas. Supporters of the Moscow trials, and D.N. Pritt in particular, would face heavy criticism at home and abroad for the choice to support Stalin. Pritt's views would bring him into conflict even with those in his own political party, especially as tensions mounted in Europe in the lead-up to World War II. Aside from presenting the facts of the case, the Times acted as a middle ground for those on either side of the debate. When Quinton Hogg sent in a letter to the editor in 1940, after the end of the trials, it was primarily a criticism of D.N. Pritt. Hogg wondered about Pritt's approval for the Soviet invasion of Finland, as well as questioned his political ties. Pritt then replied and defended himself 2 days later. Pritt stated that he remained true to his convictions and that he remained unchanged from believing in socialism. Therefore, the Times proved to be more than just a source of information, but could also be a public forum of sorts for those on different sides of the debate. The criticism continued abroad as well. In American Marxist Max Shatman's book, Behind the Moscow Trial, considerable time was spent discrediting the apparent crimes committed by the defendants, exposing the lack of evidence behind the prosecutor's case. By extension, this heavy criticism also attacked those who stood by the verdict, men such as D.N. Pritt. In Austrian Social Democrat Friedrich Adler's pamphlet, The Witchcraft Trial in Moscow, Pritt was targeted explicitly, with Adler's assertions focused on undermining Pritt's arguments. Calling him the semi-official spokesman of Moscow, Adler wondered how a man who was so against the proceedings of Germany's Reichstag trial could be so blinded by the nefarious nature of the Moscow trials. Apparently, Pritt also received directives from the Communist International on when or where to publish responses in newspapers that spoke out against the Moscow trials. To some, this may undermine his credibility, but Pritt remained steadfast in his support, and it was this steadfastness that eventually led to his expulsion from the Labour Party. When Pritt voiced his approval for the Soviet invasion of Finland in late 1939, enough was enough for his peers, who sought to distance themselves from his pro-Stalin stance. That did not stop Pritt's political goals, as he continued to sit in Parliament as an independent until 1950. These examples, though not inclusive of all, do show that there existed British support for Stalin, the Soviet Union, and the Moscow trials.
On the other end of the spectrum, the Moscow trials also acted as a final straw of sorts for some who had been sympathetic to the Soviet cause. British Stalinists were often criticized for their apparent inability to come to terms with the situation. It even occurred that names would be mentioned in one issue of the Daily Worker, only to see the individual disappear, be excommunicated, or executed by the next issue. The default response to such slip-ups was to ignore the error. Realistically, was there any real way to be up to date on the purges? The most striking example was a printed image of Stalin and NKVD head Yezhov, who was killed in 1940 during the final stages of the Great Terror he helped orchestrate. The literary world was shaken as well. Arthur Koestler, who was a Hungarian-British writer and journalist, is perhaps best known for his 1940 book Darkness at Noon. Although a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain since 1931, the Moscow trials served as a motivating factor for his eventual departure from the organization in 1938, which was the year of the third trial. In the novel, the main character, Nicholas Rubashov, remembers his own experiences while in prison after having been arrested during the purges. Rubashov's situation is marred by its utter hopelessness, as he remembered all the times he sacrificed others to move towards an idealized social state. Now he was being purged in the same way. While Stalin and the Soviet Union remained unnamed, it is commonly believed that they were the inspiration behind the novel, with the dictatorial character number 1 meant to represent Stalin himself. Due to the allegorical nature of the book, Rubashov could have been a stand-in for Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, or any of the old Bolsheviks that had been put to death as a result of the trials. The difficulty in getting Rubashov's confession was very similar to that of Bukharin, who was executed in 1938. Darkness at Noon seemed to hold fears that the creation of a revolutionary state, which had been the reasoning for the purges, was ultimately unattainable. Although he had once been a strong communist supporter, the actions of the show trials pushed Koestler away from the idea, or at least away from Stalinism. The trend of English authors battling against the USSR in their novels continued in the later 1940s, perhaps most famously through the works of George Orwell. Orwell was a socialist, though adamantly anti-Stalinist, showing that the two could be mutually exclusive ideologies. His 1945 book, Animal Farm, was another allegorical approach to Stalin's rise, this time depicting the leader of the Soviet Union as a pig named Napoleon. Basically, a chronicle of Stalin's rise. There is a section of the book that has 4 pigs executed for speaking against Napoleon's rule. Since they share the likeness of their leader, it is believed that their deaths represent the major old Bolsheviks who were put to death during the Moscow trials. Orwell continued on this trend with his final work of fiction, the 1949 novel 1984. In the book, the state of Oceania has replaced Britain and runs the nation in a brutal and oppressive fashion, like that of the Soviet Union. Original leaders of the state, men such as Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, are tried in a manner similar to the actual trials of the 1930s. Their confessions and the exaggerated nature of their apparent crimes mirror those of Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and the rest. Remember, Big Brother is watching you. These books became famous and may be seen as fanning the flames of the Cold War that emerged in the late 1940s. Between Koestler and Orwell's work, there seemed to be a diminished hope for the idealized socialist state, considering what the Soviet Union had become, given evidence through events such as the Moscow trials.
The rest of the world was not quiet about the trials either, and were also divided in their own distinct fashions. In 1937, a United States-based commission was created in order to determine the validity of the allegations against Leon Trotsky. Since Trotsky was one of the major targets of the trials, but was not in the Soviet Union to be tried, he agreed to take part in what is now called the Dewey Commission in order to answer the charges. Although the commission ended up finding Trotsky innocent, calling the trials frame-ups, and John Dewey himself was not particularly sympathetic to communism, there were still those who considered the entire affair as a foreign intrusion on a Soviet problem. This stands as yet another indication of how political divides shape the perceptions around the trials. Since the trials were done publicly, they offered a glimpse into the USSR as never before, which split the viewers based around their beliefs. The situation surrounding the Moscow trials was therefore not a clear-cut issue in Britain, which may be surprising by modern standards. Although many may have denounced the trials, there were others who supported them, and by extension, the whole Soviet system. This major socialist nation, really the first of its kind, could not be allowed to fail in their eyes, so the trials then acted as a process which could be condoned as it moved them towards a better future. Britain was not completely against the trials, as can be seen through the continued existence of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which continued until 1991. As of 2015, there is still a Communist Party of Britain, albeit diminished greatly in size. It is also important to note that not all those who supported the trials were staunch communists, such as Dennis Noel Pritt, while the trials could also push known socialists away from support of Stalin, like in the case of Arthur Koestler. Political divides were therefore major, but not the sole determining factors involved, which complicated the entire situation within Britain. The drastic outcomes that came from the Moscow trials had the power to change minds, but they also hardened others. Despite what some may think, there was definite and vocal support for Stalin and the Soviet Union's actions in Britain. In some cases, political or ideological allegiances may have dictated reactions, while others were possibly moved by the uncertainties of the interwar period. In any case, Britain reacted with a mixed bag of sorts, which may be more surprising considering what was to come. About 18 months after the third and final Moscow trial, war returned to Europe and the world when Britain declared war on Germany following its invasion of Poland. The Second World War was a complicating matter for the global political landscape, as defeat of fascism took precedence over past injustices. This may stand as an explanation for the alliances created to fight the Nazis between the likes of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, as well as the denunciation of fascism in the 1940s. This had not always been the case, however, as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 would make for strange bedfellows between Hitler and Stalin. But the Nazis would break that pact soon after, with Operation Barbarossa in 1941, which saw the invasion of German forces into the Soviet Union. As a result, the Soviet Union and Britain would find themselves in a similar position, fighting against a common enemy. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Allied powers were joined by the United States, and would then be in a position to combat the Nazi threat. This alliance would last throughout the Second World War, but the coming Cold War and the decades of uncertainty it contained oversimplified what was in fact a very complicated situation in Britain during the 1930s, as it watched the Moscow trials from the outside in. Events such as the trials are rarely as simple as that. As a final note, the picture of how the original Central Committee of the USSR changed over the tumultuous years since the Russian Revolution is astounding. Through the Civil War, through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the vast majority of the original members were dead and gone, leaving only Stalin in control of the Soviet Union. The Moscow trials indicated Stalin's power to the Soviet Union and the world. In Britain, he received plenty of support alongside the vocal opposition, showing just how divided the nation was on the issue. The Moscow trials, despite their ominous connotations, remain only a small part in a long and complicated history. However, through these instances in time, we can understand how complicated the world was, and why what we think we know about the past just might not be the whole story.